Hey everyone, and welcome back. My name is Ryan Bonfiglio, and I'm working with St. Luke's on this series designed to help you explore the complex topic of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from a biblical perspective. In our first session, we learned a bit about the history of the land of Israel, including the various names used to describe this land, who has occupied it over the years, and why it has so often been the subject of conflict. Here in this session, we'll take more of a theological approach, looking at the nature of God's promise of this land to the people of Israel. The story begins back in Genesis 12. There, God encounters a man named Abram, who is later called Abraham. At that point, Abraham is living in his native land of Haran. God tells Abraham to leave his country and his family and to set out for the land of Canaan. And so Abraham sets out to go to Canaan, and it's there that he lives, and it's where the other ancestors, like Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, and Sarah, live as well. But it's not happily ever after for the ancestors. Due to a famine, Joseph and the other sons of Jacob head off to Egypt. This move was meant to be temporary, but the Israelites end up becoming slaves in Egypt, and they remain there for some 400 years. Once God liberates the Israelites from Egypt, God directs them to return to the land promised Abraham all the way back in Genesis 12. It is this promise that fuels Israel's military invasion of the land of Canaan, which is described in the book of Joshua. Through a series of swift victories, Israel gains control of the land by the end of the book of Joshua. And while non-Israelites continue to live among them in the land, the Israelites control the land itself and continue to do so for the next 500 years, until invading armies from the east, first the Assyrians and then the Babylonians, conquer the land, bringing about what is often called the exile. When the exile ends, the prophets describe the return to the land as a type of second exodus. Isaiah describes the return to the promised land in this way. A voice cries out, "In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. Then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all people shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken." In ancient Israel's theological imagination, the land is not just a nice piece of property. They believe that God had a special relationship to this land. It's the place where Israel's temple is built, and there Israel encounters God in a unique and powerful way. It's a place of worship and sacrifice, pilgrimage and prayer, history and promise. For all these reasons, it seems that God, the land, and the people of Israel are all intricately bound together. And that's true. But at the same time, things are a bit more complicated than we often acknowledge. In this session, I want to highlight three dimensions of the land's theological importance that I think are often overlooked. First, in the Old Testament, the promise of the land is not an end, but it's a means to another end. Let's turn back to Genesis 12. There's an important detail here that I think we often miss. The text reads as follows. "Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing." It's this last part, "so that you will be a blessing," that I think we often forget. Israel is promised a land, but so that they will be a blessing to others. In Hebrew, the word translated "so that" introduces what's known as a purpose clause. In other words, it tells you the reason for the thing that comes before it. In this case, the "so that" shows us the reason the land is being promised in the first place, so that Israel will be a blessing. Being blessed with the land is not an end in its own right. It's a means to the end of blessing others. The land is thus not the ultimate thing. Being a blessing to others is the ultimate thing. The land is merely a tool that helps this to happen. This changes how we understand the promise of the land. Yes, Abraham and his descendants are chosen to have a special relationship with the land, but their chosenness is not about status or privilege. It's about an ethical responsibility. In fact, in Judaism, being chosen doesn't so much mean you have a special status. It means you don't have a choice. In other words, you're on the hook for a certain way of acting and a certain way of being in the world. And that's what Genesis 12 is really all about. Abraham and his descendants are called to a non-negotiable responsibility to be a blessing to all people, including those who live in the land of Israel alongside of them. So that's point number one. My second point that we often, I think, overlook or misunderstand follows closely from the first. And it's that the promise of the land in the Old Testament is not unconditional, it's contingent. According to the covenant God makes with Israel, Israel must abide by certain laws and ethical requirements in order to fully receive God's blessing of the land. The promise of land is the then in an if-then statement. If you will follow my ways, then you will enter and occupy the land God had promised. We see this if-then logic of the covenant clearly laid out in Deuteronomy 28, which spells out the consequences of obedience or disobedience to the laws given to Israel through Moses. Deuteronomy 28:1 says this: if you will only obey the Lord your God by diligently observing all of his commandments that I'm commanding you today, then the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. Conversely, verse 15 in the same chapter says, but if you will not obey the Lord your God by diligently observing all his commandments and decrees, which I am commanding you today, then all of these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. And if we keep reading, one of those curses is that Israel will one day lose access to the land. This idea is echoed in other parts of the Old Testament. In the book of Leviticus, for instance, we find God saying, quote, you shall keep all of my statutes and all of my ordinances and observe them so that the land to which I bring you to settle in may not vomit you out. The prophets take up a similar point of view. Jeremiah, for instance, interprets the exile as a consequence of ancient Israel following after other gods and breaking the covenant with Yahweh. They've lost the land because they have lost their faith. In all of this, we see that the promise of the land is a contingent promise, not an unconditional one. It depends on faithfulness to the covenant. In other words, the substance of the promise does not exist outside of a covenantal system. It's not meant to be a once-for-all promise that justifies all forms of political control or political ambition. Far from it. The contingent nature of the promise, theologically speaking, is meant to prompt self-reflection and even confession. Jeremiah the prophet puts it this way, quote, turn now, every one of you, from your evil way and wicked doings, and you will remain upon the land that the Lord has given to you and your ancestors from of old and forever. In Jeremiah's vision, the promise of the land remains, but only if the people return to God and follow the covenant. Now, we need to be really careful here, friends. We should not conclude that whenever Israel is found to be outside of the land of Israel, that it is a sign of God's punishment. Nor should we conclude in any straightforward way that God sent the Babylonians or the Greeks or the Romans or even the Nazis as punishment for the Jews. This is not something Scripture would affirm, and we need to actively guard against coming to any of those conclusions. So, let's recap where we've been so far. The land has a deep and abiding theological significance in the Old Testament, but at the same time, the promise of the land is not an end, it's a means to another end, an end of blessing others. And second, the promise of the land is not unconditional, but rather contingent. Let me conclude by adding a third point. Despite the land's obvious importance, being in the land is never a prerequisite for participation in God's covenant at any point in the Old Testament. One key place we see this is at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. There we find the Israelites in the plains of Moab, just to the east of the land of Canaan. They've already wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and now they are poised to cross over into the land God had promised Abraham all the way back in Genesis 12. If this were a Hollywood film, the story would end with their iconic leader Moses leading the people across the Jordan and setting up camp in the land. The people would celebrate, the trumpets would sound, and the credits would roll. But this is not Hollywood, and this is not how the book of Deuteronomy ends. The Israelites remain in the plains of Moab, still not yet in the land of Canaan, as Deuteronomy comes to a close. And even more surprisingly, Moses dies. Israel's most beloved leader, the very person to whom God had given the law and used to liberate his people from Egypt, never touches foot in the so-called Promised Land. This seems like an incredibly disappointing ending to the book of Deuteronomy. So, what do we make of it? I want to suggest that while this ending would be considered disappointing according to the standards of Hollywood, it's actually meant to be profoundly hopeful for the people of Israel. Here's what I mean. Remember from last session that most Jews and ancient Israelites throughout history would have lived outside of the land of Israel. This would have gone all the way back to the time of the exile. So if you are reading the Bible while living in diaspora or living outside of the land, you might be wondering, can I fully be God's people even though I don't live in the land of Israel? Are we somehow lesser? Or is our spiritual experience somehow less whole without access to the land? According to the end of Deuteronomy, the answer is a resounding no. Think about it. Under Moses, the people are already fully constituted as God's covenant people. God calls them his treasured possession, a priestly kingdom, and a holy nation, even while they remained in the wilderness. Scripture affirms that there never has been a prophet like Moses, even though he never steps foot in the land of Israel. All of this is profoundly good news for Jews living in the diaspora. It reminds them that they, like the Israelites at the end of Deuteronomy, are full participants in God's covenant, even though they might never step foot in the land of Israel. A similar point is made in the opening chapters of the book of Ezekiel. It's the beginning of the exile as we turn to Ezekiel, and the Babylonians have just taken control of Jerusalem. In the midst of this turmoil, the prophet has a vision of God's throne, which was thought to symbolize God's presence in the temple. And Ezekiel sees the throne rise up above the temple, and it has wheels and wings, and it can move in any direction. And the prophet sees God's now mobile throne leave Jerusalem and head east to the land of the Babylonians, precisely where the Israelites were being deported. How are we to understand this strange vision? What Ezekiel is showing us is that God's presence is not restricted to the temple or even to the land. God's presence is able to move with the Israelites beyond the land, even into exile. While the fall of Jerusalem is an incredible tragedy, it does not signal the end of Israel's access to God. God goes where the people are, even if it's outside of the land of Israel. Whether in exile or diaspora, the Israelites remain fully constituted as God's people. Thus, in the Old Testament, the promise of land is not an ultimate end. It's not an unconditional promise, and it's not necessary for full participation in God's covenant. Rather, the land is a theological promise. The land symbolizes something other than just a geopolitical territory. The land symbolizes the idea of belonging in a community, and it symbolizes proximity to God. God holds out this promise of belonging and proximity, whether the Israelites are in the land or outside of the land. Access to the land might be elusive and impermanent, but access to God is secure, both for Israel and for the church today.